The snow was quiet and comforting. The soft crunch of loose snow and the stillness of the land was the sound of peace for Scout Sergeant Rauparaha of the 228th Arataki Lightfoot. Well, it had been, until day came. Looking down through his magnoculars from his mountaintop vantage point, he could see them. Shapes in the distance, 5 walking machines as tall as buildings, Titans of the Imperium. He recalled that the Mechanicum called the Titans god machines. Rauparaha hated that term. The only god was the Emperor. These iron machines were beasts of war and nothing more. Although even he could not doubt their power or effectiveness on the battlefield. Or, looking over at what had once been a series of quiet snowy hills, now a series of bogs, craters and slush, their ability to cause a mess. He looked over again at the Titans and their battlefield, the bones and remains of a blasted-out ruined hive city, cut down to its roots, during some long-forgotten war. Still many kilometers away, the bones of the hive city stuck up like shards of iron into the sky, and Rauparaha focused and saw the foe they were opposing. Giant greenskin walking machines, whose presence had caused so much damage to the Imperial Guard units in the last few weeks, necessitating the requirement to call Imperial Titans into battle. Rauparaha looked out and realized that if he had a radio, he would have acted as a perfect spotter for the Imperial Titans, but he did not. So instead, he silently acted as a witness for what was to come. Refocusing his magnoculars on the Imperial force, he could see the 2 small Warhound Titans, as his training had taught him they were called, advancing away from the east. Soon, blasts of flame, visible even from his mountaintop vantage, erupted from the leading Titan into ruined buildings and trenches as they passed, while its twin just advanced silently behind the first, calm and quiet. He looked over towards the other end of the ruined hive and saw the Orc machines begin to move towards the Imperial lines. Looking back, he could see the largest Imperial Titan advance slowly, while the 2 medium-sized, well, Rauparaha chuckled to himself, medium-sized for giant war machines, stayed in place. The leading 2 Imperial Titans moved far ahead of the rest, a dangerous move considering Rauparaha could see the Orc machines advancing towards them, and the damage that the Orcs had caused to the Imperial forces some days ago. The nearest Stomper was just the nearest Orc war machine was just behind a ruined tower support, a few hundred meters out from the leading Imperial Titan. The first Warhound got close and the Orc war machine erupted out, firing guns at the Warhounds, rounds hammering into the void shields of the leading Titan, but the fire was ill-disciplined and inaccurate. The Titan behind the first fired an oversized plasma cannon from one hand, and a twin blast of light from its other. These hammered into the Orc war machine, knocking it back. Without power fields or void shields, the Orc war machine was helpless. Then, another twin blast of light from the leading Titan hammered the Orc walker in the head, and the Orc machine fell down dead. The 2 Warhounds walked forward. Rauparaha looked behind to the other Imperial Titans who were now advancing into the ruined hive. He did see that the destruction of the small Orc machine had caused a hornet's nest. He could see 3 Orc walkers moving rapidly towards the Imperial lines, while he could see the distinct blobs of hordes of Orcs moving towards the Imperials. 2 of the giant Orc walkers moved out into the open and began firing at the giant Imperial warlord. The warlord triggered its war horn. Audible even from this vast distance, Rauparaha could hear it just faintly on the wind. Laser blasts erupted out from its shoulders, hammering into the first Orc walker, while a blast of plasma from its massive oversized cannon turned the Orc walker into a bubbling tower of plasma and scrap. That still walked on, despite the laws of physics and reason, before it finally smashed to the ground after a few hundred meters. The second Orc Titan fired all of its weapons, but these harmlessly hammered into the warlord's void shields. Another salvo of plasma and laser erupted into the Orc Titan, turning it into a ball of fire. The faint boom of its death could be heard by Rauparaha on the wind, But then another faint explosion could be heard, and Rauparaha refocused his magnoculars, looking around, until he found the Imperial Warhound. One of the Warhounds was gone, buried under a huge pile of rubble from a ruined hive tower, while the second Titan fired its plasma cannon into another building. An orc ambush, obviously. It collapsed the ruined building onto the advancing Warhound, encasing it in the rubble. The remaining Warhound reversed and moved back around the ambush site, rockets and shots hammering into its void shields. Then another thumped explosion was heard on the wind, and Rauparaha looked around and found what had caused the sound. Another orc walker. It was burning, with multiple holes in its frame, the top of the machine burning with gouts of fire erupting from its head. The Imperial Reaver Titan advanced past the burning orc war machine and walked onwards unhindered. Looking around at the disposition, all but one of the Imperial Titans were advancing. Only a medium-sized Titan at the back with a huge cannon on its shoulders hung back behind the others. Rauparaha tried to think of what the design was called, but harking back to his training, he had no idea what this Titan was called, but instead just looked on and out towards the Imperial Warhounds again. Rauparaha looked away from his magnoculars and rubbed his eyes, taking a drink from his water canteen for a moment, before looking back and finding the first Warhound again. He found it, just as the Warhound was hammered by a volley of rounds. The Warhound only had time to fire a single shot from its plasma cannon before its shields was ruptured, and it was obliterated by hundreds of rounds of incoming fire and slumped over dead, its top half bisected, leaking oil and fire on the ground. Rauparaha looked around through his magnoculars confused. He had no idea what could cause such a thing. What sort of firepower was capable of destroying an Imperial Titan so easily? It was only by unfocusing his magnoculars that he realized what he had mistaken for a massive piece of ruined hive was in fact a giant orc war machine as tall as the Warlord Titan, bristling with firepower. It advanced forward, its guns turning onto the Warlord. Its guns hammered into the Titan's void shields, while the Warlord's laser blasters and plasma cannon hammered into power fields emanating from the giant orc abomination. Laser fire from the Reaver hammered into the orc's power shields, for a massive earth-shaking cannon round struck the power shields, temporarily disrupting them with its force. Looking back, Rauparaha could see the rearmost Imperial Titan firing with its massive shoulder cannon at the orc abomination. Then the Reaver stopped. Rauparaha watched as it stopped in place, bracing itself, before a giant missile on its back fired out towards the orc gargant. The missile seemed to vanish before... Rauparaha looked back to the orc walker and watched as a void of pure darkness appeared to absorb the right gun arm of the orc gargant. Rauparaha had to quickly look away and avert his eyes as he vomited as he saw the orb of blackness become a void of colours too painful to look upon. Rauparaha retched again, vomiting bile onto the ground, before mustering his constitution and looking out over the battlefield again. The painful orb of blackness and dark colours had vanished, alongside with the majority of the right side of the massive orc gargant. Having lost this much of itself, the orc's power shields failed, and plasma blasts and laser shots hammered into it, but these did little effect and the machine advanced on regardless. The orc machine raised its remaining arm, a massive chain blade the size of a building, with teeth as large as tanks, and it charged towards the Imperial Warlord. The Warlord sounded its war horn and charged to meet it, firing with its weapons as it went. The orc's machine arm had longer reach, and it rented a chunk from the Warlord's shoulder armor. The Warlord responded by stepping into the blow, catching the chain blade with its power claw. Power field and chain teeth sparked off each other as the two war machines attempted to use their strength to wrench the other's weapon arms from their shoulders. The Warlord turned up its plasma cannon and fired at point-blank range, shots hammering into the gargant's belly. Molten holes of plasma and lumps of metal vented from the orc's machine's wounded belly, but it still started to push the Warlord's claw arm down with its strength. The Warlord switched tactics and targeted the orc's weapon arm, its plasma cannon hammering into the elbow joint of the orc machine. It fired until its plasma cannon vented coolant and ceased firing, and then, With a massive wrench, the warlord's power claw ripped the arm off the orc machine, casting it to the ground. The warlord then boomed with its warhorn and slashed its claw into the chest of the orc machine, ripping out its mechanical insides before stabbing the orc machine through its head, and with a wrench pulled the head free. The warlord cast the Gargant's head on the ground and then boomed its warhorn again. It turned and marched back towards Imperial lines with the 2 remaining Titans escorting it. Rauparaha was distracted from his thoughts by the sound of scree moving behind him. Looking back, he saw the Major and her command staff walking towards him. "Sergeant, the enemy war machines are down. Ready your squad. The company moves in 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am." The sergeant spared one last glance back towards the distant shape of the Imperial Titans, before picking up his rifle and kit bag and heading back towards his gathering squad.